paramilitary troops and disarm them. Behind the initial force of British, French and American troops is a multinational force for Kosovo, which will number around 50,000. Our report.
The British soldiers can be under no illusion about the enormity of the task that lies ahead of them and the dangers that are surely there. The Gurkhas and the paratroopers who are at the heart of the initial ground force came prepared with huge amounts of equipment, armored personnel carriers and ammunition. They waited at the border crossing point as the last frustrating hours passed until H hour, when they would go into Kosovo. As they did so, news came through that the Russians had beaten them to it and had gone into Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. As the dawnlight rose over this mountainous region, at 0500 local time came the historic moment. Chinook helicopters carrying British paratroopers and their vehicles entered Kosovo. Their task to secure the high points around the main route into Kosovo. They were supported by American Apache helicopters. Within minutes, the ground forces moved in. They were led by the 5th Airborne Brigade. Close behind came the Gurkhas, who marched into Kosovo. Units of British forces began assembling at the Kosovo border in the early hours of the morning. The British soldiers can be under no illusion about the enormity of the task that lies ahead of them and the dangers that are...
Just to say, we'll try and pick up our conversation with David in a moment. I don't suppose he can hear me, and we certainly can't hear him as these bits of military kit make their way up the road. David, a little pause between vehicles. Can you talk to us?
Diplomatic and political wrangling, Operation Agricola reverted to Plan A, and at H hour, 0430 local time, the first helicopters carrying paratroopers and combat engineers and light vehicles leapfrogged the waiting armour to secure the hilltops and ridges above the road inside Kosovo. 2 hours had been allocated for that job. It took less, and the Household Cavalry Reconnaissance Unit was ordered to move up towards the border, en route passing a refugee camp, where Albanians who had fled from Kosovo cheered the tanks and armoured vehicles on their way. Travelling with the reconnaissance unit are Albanian translators, themselves refugees, to communicate with any Albanian irregulars along the road to Pristina. And that is the destination, which is why, given the news from there, that Russian-speaking soldiers have been added to the convoy. Once over the border, it quickly ran into its first problem. Suspected mines inside a tunnel, which halted not only the reconnaissance squadron, but the whole ground force. That tunnel was cleared, but now there's been an explosion in another tunnel up ahead. And so the armoured advance is once again halted and is now getting behind schedule. Keith Graves, Sky News, on the road to Pristina.
When the moment came after hours of anxious waiting, it was a scramble to get on board the waiting helicopter. For the experienced Gurkhas, it was a moment of relief. Everything they'd been training for would now be put into practice. The scenes from the gun window were reminiscent of earlier conflicts. An eagle eye watching the countryside, the first troops to see these villages since the Serbs pulled out. Then a step into the unknown, what had until very recently been enemy territory. These Gurkhas will help clear the roads for the first armoured cars of the 4th Armoured Brigade. What followed was nerve-wracking.
Right, just stay where you are. Vehicle coming.
Mines could litter these roads, the route to Pristina. There's only one way to check for landmines. Lives are clearly at risk here.
The route is now proven from here all the way up to a white baseline that's on the floor, so you are safe. So you can walk normally, but please do not cross the white line.
Inch by inch, foot by foot, the NATO forces are on their way to the Kosovo capital. And all the time, there's the risk of fighting with renegade forces. One of the biggest risks for these paratroopers, engineers and Gurkhas is tiredness. It's exhausting work in the heat. And there are 8 tunnels between the border and Pristina, all of them potentially booby-trapped.
This tunnel was to go bang and it was to collapse, then it will require a substantial engineering effort to put it right and to get going. So at this stage, it would be foolhardy for me to speculate exactly when we're going to push armour forward.
Eventually, the tunnel's declared safe, but the road to Pristina is packed with incident. A first meeting with the KLA, and the Gurkhas insist they're disarmed.
We did this together with NATO. NATO was our partner.
It's a poignant moment, but most seem too preoccupied to talk. Tim Friend, Sky News.
As the troops pushed into Kosovo, they found a group of...
was stalled at the first tunnel on the road to Pristina as ordnance experts and combat engineers struggled to clear the area of mines and booby traps on the outskirts of the town of Kačanik. And at the tunnel entrance, the first tense standoff between a detachment of Gurkhas and the commandant of a Serbian military uniformed police unit.
Before he can proceed, he must hand over all his weapons, and then he can go ahead.
Under the rifles of the troops, the British officer patiently and firmly persuaded him to surrender his submachine gun. Despite his protestations, he needed it to be armed against KLA irregulars operating in the area. And then, one by one, they did the same to all of his men. The rules of engagement here are individuals who give themselves up are not to be harmed, and they are to be disarmed. The villages inside Kosovo on the road to Pristina are deserted. There are no signs of any Serbian civilians. David Chater, Sky News.
Idea that they came here with
NATO forces fight.
Americans.
Well, great air of professionalism and to some extent relief from the British forces that we're now getting on with it.
Roads leading to the province have been blocked by approaching troops. The Macedonian border town of Blace has seen military traffic jams. British soldiers have already gone into action, stopping and searching Yugoslav cars between the Blace crossing and the Kosovan capital Pristina. In London, the Defence Secretary dismissed claims that the United States had delayed the start of the operation by insisting its forces should be the first to go in.
There's absolutely...
Mr. Robertson wrote off as a mere sideshow to the big picture. Foreign Minister...
Tonight, and a senior administration official tells us one reason why. We're told by this official that U.S. intelligence earlier today had intercepted the orders to these troops when they were moving through Yugoslavia, and we're told those orders were that these troops not enter Kosovo. Now, as they demand answers from the Russian government, the White House also looking into whether there were later orders came that were changing those and ordered these troops into Kosovo, or whether this was a rogue operation. The man leading the White House questioning is Undersecretary of State.
8 tunnels and 3 bridges that needed to be cleared.
Now, we've seen some of the heavy armour moving up. What in particular has been on the road?
Right, well, there you've got a Challenger main battle tank, 70 tons of tank, crew of 4 with a 120mm gun, a very, very significant piece of equipment, one of the best tanks and best armoured tanks in the world. Now, that is belongs to the King's Royal Hussars, and they have got their entire regiment down there, and what they do, they split them up into battle groups. So you'll have a squadron of tanks and a company of infantry in warriors all pushing forward together. These are from A Squadron, the King's Royal Hussars. You can tell that because there's a triangle marking symbol, the yellow symbol there. So that's A Squadron, the King's Royal Hussars, and this is the lead element of that squadron of Challenger main battle tanks. and they all have a mixture of equipment, and here we're looking back down.
Piece, and then they put the next one in. It's a whole brigade, so it's going to take some time, but outside of finding the mine, there's been no real resistance here. There are no real problems. When they came across the border, it was nearly deserted. Only saw 4 KLA soldiers, and all the way up here, we've seen where they've been, but not any sign of them at all. Very, very large, heavy pieces of equipment coming through here. Again, this is the 4th Brigade of the British Army, and he's about ready to take this large engineering piece across the bridge. As I said, they can only do one at a time, so it's a fairly slow process. And you can see he's now crossing.
That altogether, as of midday, about 1,000 British troops had entered Kosovo, but that number is increasing by the minute as forces pour in. They say that aside from the landmines, checking for landmines, is fixing the roads, because those roads are not only going to be important for the KFOR force, but also for the refugees, the hundreds of thousands.
The situation we're involved in, the armoured division moving up piece by piece up this long road all the way to Pristina. It's been a long convoy, and perhaps given that the start was so successfully speedy, it's surprising perhaps it's taken so long, but there have been a great many interruptions on the way. The first tunnel the column encountered was found to be booby-trapped. The engineers had to come in. It was found by the Gurkhas, and the engineers came in and cleared that. They moved to the next tunnel, and same again, they found another device which had to be sorted out. All this meant a delay of this column, and the column now stretches far back all the way to the border. We're about 6 kilometers in now, and also up ahead, I estimate, at least 4 or 5 miles ahead now, a solid form of ordnance, and also in the form of people who aren't quite up to speed with how they should be behaving now under the latest agreement.
Andrew, thankfully the truck seems to have slowed down a little.
Vehicles move forwards that many vehicles length and then stop again. This is not the same tank that I was standing next to 10 minutes ago when I spoke to you last. And it will be, I'm sure, an arduous journey now for these vehicles, purely because of the build-up. There's no widening of the road at any stage. It's the same kind of road, the full 50 kilometers through to Pristina. The original NATO plan was not to go that far, was only to go in 10 kilometers. Now they've decided
down through Niš in the south of Serbia, and then they stayed at the border. We're sure they got instructions from somewhere, because they held up for at least a couple of hours, and then they moved in, and they rolled down this high street about 12:30 last night to an absolutely rapturous welcome from thousands of Serbs who gave them brandy, threw flowers at them, and fired their Kalashnikovs and their pistols in the air in celebration.
Tim, let's be absolutely clear about the Russian intentions here. You've been saying all along.
Challenger tanks just went past us, and then a lighter skinned vehicle, the Scimitar, also part of one of the armoured regiments, and then some more support vehicles. Over here, it might be interesting, some of the Gurkhas are now coming back from their duties further up the road, where they were clearing that, helping clear that tunnel that slowed down the convoy that Keith Graves talked about earlier on in his report. They've been working, they may now be replaced by another 2 or 3 platoons of Gurkhas to keep up their remit, which is to keep this front end of the road clear and under control. Interestingly enough, in keeping the peace, it's a small card, sometimes blue, sometimes green, with clearly written instructions in short, crisp, army-like sentences entitled challenging and warning shots, when to open fire, how much to use minimum force. Here comes another light-skinned tank following up with the armoured division. The card is quite clear. No idea why, perhaps when you hear the noise and the impression this vehicle is making as they come towards you. With a smile on his face, General Jackson told me that there is.
When the moment came after hours of anxious waiting, it was a scramble to get on board the waiting helicopter. For the experienced Gurkhas, it was a moment of relief. Everything they'd been training for would now be put into practice. The scenes from the gun window were reminiscent of earlier conflicts. An eagle eye watching the countryside, the first troops to see these villages since the Serbs pulled out. Then a step into the unknown, what had until very recently been enemy territory. These Gurkhas will help clear the roads for the first armoured cars of the 4th Armoured Brigade. What followed was nerve-wracking.
Right, just stay where you are. Vehicle coming.
Mines could litter these roads, the route to Pristina. There's only one way to check for landmines. Lives are clearly at risk here.
The route is now proven from here all the way up to a white baseline that's on the floor, so you are safe. So you can walk normally, but please do not cross the white line.
Inch by inch, foot by foot, the NATO forces are on their way to the Kosovo capital. And all the time there's the risk of fighting with renegade forces. One of the biggest risks for these paratroopers, engineers and Gurkhas is tiredness. It's exhausting work in the heat. And there are 8 tunnels between the border and Pristina, all of them potentially booby-trapped.
This tunnel was to go bang and it was to collapse, then it will require a substantial engineering effort to put it right and to get going. So at this stage it would be foolhardy for me to speculate exactly when we're going to push armour forward.
Eventually the tunnel's declared safe, but the road to Pristina is packed with incident. A first meeting with the KLA, and the Gurkhas insist they're disarmed.
We did this together with NATO. NATO was our partner.
It's a poignant moment, but most seem too preoccupied to talk. Tim Friend, Sky News.
Installed at the first tunnel on the road to Pristina as ordnance experts and combat engineers struggle to clear the area of mines and booby traps on the outskirts of the town of Kačanik. And at the tunnel entrance, the first tense standoff between a detachment of Gurkhas and the commandant of a Serbian military uniformed police unit.
Before he can proceed, he must hand over all his weapons, then he can go ahead.
Under the rifles of the troops, the British officer patiently and firmly persuaded him to surrender his submachine gun. Despite his protestations, he needed it to be armed against KLA irregulars operating in the area. And then, one by one, they did the same to all of his men. The rules of engagement here are individual. The road to Pristina are deserted. There are no signs of any Serbian civilians. Serbian paramilitary police and troops are peeling back. No vacuum is being left. There has been gunfire, but so far isolated and sporadic. The rules of engagement are to use force only in self-defense, and only the minimum force necessary. The orders to treat everyone humanely. Warning shots are to be fired only after the challenge, NATO, stop or I will fire.
The impact of heavy armour is incredible in peacekeeping operations. I mean, in Bosnia, it had great impact on the locals. And there are a lot of critics saying, oh, tanks and heavy armour aren't suitable for this type of operation. But it really is what NATO would call a force multiplier. A single tank or a squadron of tanks sends a very clear political signal. It is almost the gunship of the 20th century, gunship diplomacy. We are projecting power and it's here to stay.
In terms of the hazards along the route, now we've seen some of the mine clearance operations going on today. Are they as expected? Not as bad as maybe had been anticipated?
Troops. The Macedonian border town of Blace has seen military traffic jams. But they're well on the...
The Serbian half of Pristina was overjoyed. They see the Russians as an army of liberation to prevent NATO occupation. They threw roses, gave brandy, and fired into the air to celebrate. The tens of thousands of Pristina's Kosovar Albanians may be less happy. They stayed inside their homes. The Russian force may be small, but it's symbolic. Its entry into Kosovo designed to calm the fears of the Serb population. Having paraded through town, the message will get out to all of Kosovar's Serbs, you're safe, you don't need to leave when the Albanian refugees come home. Belgrade and Moscow may be acting in concert on this one. With the Russians having achieved that, they can concentrate on cooperating with the advancing NATO forces and work out which sector to work in and how. This morning we went towards the airport, but were stopped at a Yugoslav army checkpoint. Behind that was a Russian APC. they're still here and staying.
Paratroopers are within a few kilometers of the Kosovan capital of Pristina. Convoy of British tanks and armored vehicles making good progress towards the city, earlier delayed for several hours as explosive experts swept the road of mines left by departing Serbian soldiers.
That's a crossing in northern Macedonia. To see there the first American forces, the beginning of the convoy. Just before we came on the air, that convoy arrived, moving steadily towards the border crossing. You can see the concrete canopy in the background. They are now advancing. The British forces, the vanguard of the NATO operation, left this point about 8 hours ago.
Are on the move. They're about 10 kilometers inside now. About half of the brigade has moved past us here at this point where we're being held. There is a tremendous amount of firepower coming through here. As you look behind me, you can see these are basically the fighting vehicles, but 155 self-propelled howitzers, the Challenger tanks. We've seen just about everything come through here already. They're making their way across a bridge, across the river here, the first of two bridges and two tunnels that they will have to cross through. Part of the delay this morning was while they were checking, they wanted to make sure that there were no landmines there. They wanted to make sure that the explosives that had been rigged on this bridge had been removed. Also, they wanted to test the integrity of the bridge, and the way they did that was with a Chinook helicopter. This American heavy lift helicopter was brought in, and it basically went to the middle of the bridge and sat down and just hovered on the bridge to test to make sure that it was able to hold the weight of the helicopter. If it could hold the helicopter, then it could hold a tank as it crossed, but they have been going over one at a time. There have also been Apache helicopters hovering overhead. When we first arrived here, the first half hour, the Apaches were hovering in position overhead just in case there were any problems down below, but no resistance was met here at the bridge. They've basically been very quiet. Some ground troops have also been moving in within the last couple of hours. Each one of these tanks that you see go across and armored personnel carriers, they have probably 15 or 20 troops inside, so few people are having to walk, but we have seen some 2.5-ton trucks that have been coming in filled with NATO troops, British troops on their way in. British paratroops moved ahead of the armor, and now the armor is pulling up from behind. So there is a lot going on here. There are a lot of heavy equipment making its way towards Pristina, but they have to cross the... They are heavy, and they stop on a dime. They say they can go from 50 miles an hour to nothing, and it's not like the brake pad, so...
to the Macedonian, from the Macedonian border into Kosovo itself. Those hills you can see in the distance, that's Kosovo. Just about 2 minutes ago, as I say, 26 members of the 82nd Airborne Division moved across that border in Humvee armored vehicles. They were amid a convoy of mainly British forces. Those British forces have been flooding across that border most of today, heading up along that this main road to Pristina, the provincial capital. It's very noisy here, as we can see, following on from those American personnel carriers of the German army, of course, under the command of NATO. It appears that all the different nationalities of contributing forces to NATO appear to be moving on at the moment through this border crossing. There goes another Leopard tank from the German army. On the side of it, stenciled KFOR, of course, the Kosovo Peace Implementation Force. Just a few moments ago, to recap, as I say, the first American...
Hot and long. We've had a lot of difficulties on the way, moving through the Kacharnik defile in particular. A lot of traffic moving through the defile, so it's been quite slow. But now we're making good progress up toward Pristina.
You're the first guys?
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
So those pictures just towards the city after being delayed for several hours as explosives experts swept the road of mines left by departing Serb soldiers.
Of this airfield at the moment. It's a highly sensitive area, and there are negotiations ongoing about what sort of access the British troops will have to that airfield.
Well, Jeremy, we are seeing pictures of some of the NATO advance earlier before you arrived, of course. How easy was it to get to where you are just outside Pristina near Slatina?
It really was quite easy. I think the problems were mainly down to the sheer weight of traffic rather than any obstacles put in the way by the Serbs. It was an interesting journey in many ways. For the soldiers here, their first day in Kosovo brought the first sights of burned-out villages, the sort of sights which they'll become very accustomed to over the coming months. And at one stage, we even saw a couple of houses still on fire, which just shows that the whole process and the whole cycle of violence continues here, even as the Serbs prepare their withdrawal.
Jeremy, we can now just remind ourselves of the Russian forces.
KFOR forces today is to get as far as Pristina, is to secure the airport there, and is to make